Picture this: a cold morning in a cramped medieval town, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. But something is missing. The usual bustle of the marketplace is eerily quiet, the grain sacks nearly empty, and the faces of your neighbors drawn with hunger. This wasn't just a bad season. It was a full-blown famine, a slow, grinding disaster that could drag on for months or even years. Yet somehow, against all odds, ordinary people found ways to survive. How did they do it? That's the story we're about to uncover. One of desperation, ingenuity, and the unbreakable bonds of community in the face of unimaginable hardship. Famine wasn't just about empty stomachs. It reshaped entire societies. When crops failed and prices soared, medieval towns became for survival. Families traded heirlooms for a loaf of bread. People foraged for roots and bark, things no one would normally eat. Some turned to desperate measures, like smuggling or even crime, just to feed their children. But amidst the struggle, there were also quiet acts of heroism. Neighbors sharing meager rations, farmers hiding grain to outwit greedy landlords, entire communities banding together to protect the weakest among them. These stories aren't just relics of the past. They're a testament to the resilience of ordinary people when pushed to the brink. So why does this matter to us today? Because while our supermarkets may be full, the lessons of the medieval world still echo. When disaster strikes, whether it's a natural catastrophe or an economic collapse, it's not kings or armies that keep society running. It's the everyday choices of ordinary people, the same kind of grit and creativity that got medieval towns through their darkest hours. Over the next few minutes, we'll explore the forgotten tactics they used, from hidden food caches to the surprising role of medieval charity. You'll discover how communities adapted, improvised, and sometimes even thrived in the face of starvation. By the end, you won't just see the Middle Ages differently. You might just see our own world in a new light too. The rhythm of famine in medieval Europe was cruel but predictable. Every 20 or 30 years, like clockwork, disaster would strike. A summer too wet, a winter too long, a swarm of locusts darkening the fields. Any of these could unravel the fragile balance keeping towns fed. When harvests failed, prices didn't just rise, they exploded. A loaf of bread could cost 50 times its normal price, turning basic sustenance into a luxury only the rich could afford. In the year 1316, for instance, records from Flanders describe families selling their beds, their tools, even the beams from their own houses just to buy a sack of grain. But hunger was only the beginning. Starving bodies became walking invitations for disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and the bloody flux deadlier than ever. Town chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 tell haunting stories. Parents leaving infants at church doors. Villages where only a handful of skeletal survivors remained. Even whispers of cannibalism in the most desperate regions. One priest wrote of watching his parishioners dig up freshly buried corpses, not for theft, but for something far more chilling. Yet even in this abyss, human ingenuity flickered like a candle in the wind. When grain ran out, people turned to the unthinkable. They ground acorns into flour, boiled nettles for soup, even baked bread from fern roots and tree bark. In coastal towns, fishermen who once sold their catch at market now guarded their nets fiercely, turning the shoreline into a lifeline. Some families fermented spoiled grain into weak beer, knowing the alcohol might kill harmful bacteria when the water itself wasn't safe to drink. And always, there were the secret stashes, grain buried beneath floorboards, cheeses hidden in wells, small hoards kept back from landlords' demands. These weren't acts of greed, but of communal survival. A single hidden sack could mean the difference between a village that made it through the winter and one that vanished from the tax rolls forever. What's remarkable isn't just the suffering, but the systems that emerged to counter it. Towns implemented rationing centuries before modern governments. Bakers were fined for selling underweight loaves, millers forbidden from taking extra grain as payment. In Italy, some cities set up municipal granaries, buying up surplus in good years to distribute in bad ones. Churches transformed into soup kitchens, offering poor tables where anyone could get a bowl of thin gruel, no questions asked. And when all else failed, there was migration. Starving peasants would abandon their fields, flooding into cities where rumors of food persisted, only to find streets already crowded with others just like them. The real tragedy: many famines were man-made disasters wrapped in natural ones. Lords continued exporting grain for profit while their tenants starved. Soldiers passing through would seize what little food remained, leaving villages to wither. Even the weather wasn't entirely to blame. Crop monocultures, poor soil management, and feudal obligations often made bad situations catastrophic. But in the cracks between these failures, ordinary people kept finding ways to endure. They didn't just survive famine, they redefined what survival meant. A mother stretching one egg into a week's worth of meals, a blacksmith trading repaired tools for wild mushrooms, children sent to monasteries where they'd at least get one meal a day. These small acts of defiance stacked up until spring finally came. When the grain bins ran low, medieval towns didn't just hope for better days, they got creative. Rationing wasn't a suggestion, it was survival law. Town councils appointed bread inspectors to weigh every loaf, ensuring no baker shortchanged starving families. In London during the famine of 1258, records show bakers faced public flogging for selling underweight bread. But rationing went deeper than rules, it became a mindset. Families repurposed every scrap. Bones boiled for days to make gelatinous broth. Vegetable peels, normally tossed to pigs, became the base of thin soups. Even the bran usually fed to livestock was sifted back into flour, turning bread gritty and gray, but filling bellies a little longer. Then there were the recipes no one would touch in good times. Manuscripts from monasteries reveal instructions for hunger bred a grim mix of ground acorns, dried peas, and sometimes even sawdust to add bulk. One 14th century German cookbook describes boiling nettles with a handful of barley to make poor man's porridge, a dish so bitter it was normally fed to prisoners. But in famine years, these recipes spread like wildfire. Women traded them at wells and markets, passing on knowledge like heirlooms. The act of cooking itself transformed. Without enough fuel to keep ovens hot, people baked dense, flat loaves on heated stones or shared communal ovens to conserve firewood. But frugality had its dark side. Hoarding wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you banished. In French towns during the Great Famine, authorities conducted surprise house searches, confiscating hidden grain to redistribute. Church sermons thundered against the sin of surplus, framing sharing as divine duty. A haunting account from Burgundy describes a miller lynched by his neighbors after being caught hiding sacks of flour while children starved. Yet paradoxically, some hoarding was heroic. Families with pregnant women or the elderly often kept tiny reserves. A cup of grain sewn into a mattress, a wedge of cheese buried in ash, knowing charity couldn't stretch to everyone. What's striking is how these practices blurred the line between desperation and innovation. When the Abbey of ran low on wheat in 1320, monks experimented with chestnut flour, normally considered peasant food, and discovered it could make passable biscuits. Vineyard workers in Tuscany, watching grapes wither on the vine, learned to press unripe fruit for tart, famine wine that at least provided calories. Even the wealthy adapted. A noblewoman's household account from York shows her ordering servants to gather dandelions for salads, a dish she'd have scorned in prosperous times. This wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about preserving dignity. A mother serving bark bread might tell her children it was forest cake. Towns held thin feasts where the rich dined modestly in solidarity, donating the saved food to paupers. The very language of meals changed. What people once called leftovers became tomorrow's blessing. These small acts of reframing hunger, of making the unbearable feel intentional, may have been as vital as the food itself. Because in the end, surviving famine wasn't just about what people ate. It was about how they refused to let scarcity define their humanity. When the fields yielded nothing but dust, medieval townspeople became masters of urban foraging, turning their hungry eyes to every alley, forest, and ditch for something, anything, to eat. Nettles, those stinging weeds we avoid today, were harvested with thick gloves and boiled into bitter soups packed with vitamins. Wild berries, often picked before they fully ripened, provided fleeting sweetness in a world gone sour. But foraging was a dangerous gamble. Mushroom gatherers risked poisoning entire families with a single fungus, and herbalists peddled so-called hunger killer potions, mixtures of ground herbs, chalk, and sometimes opium, that claimed to dull stomach pains but often worsened suffering. The streets themselves became hunting grounds. Rats, normally despised, were trapped and roasted, their meat described in one Florentine diary as stringy but better than nothing. Pigeons, once protected as property of local lords, vanished from rooftops as starving citizens devised clever snares. In coastal towns, people combed tide pools for crabs and limpets, while inland communities dredged ponds for frogs and water plants. One account from Strasbourg tells of families boiling old leather shoes and belts, skimming the greasy film off the top to make a thin, rancid broth. What's chilling is how hunger rewrote the rules of what counted as nourishment. Bark bread, made by scraping the inner layer of elm or birch trees, became so common that some towns regulated its sale. Beech nuts, normally fed to pigs, were ground into oily flour. When even these ran out, people turned to famine foods that walked the line between sustenance and poison. Henbane seeds, known to cause hallucinations, were baked into bread in tiny amounts to stave off hunger pangs. Dock leaves, normally used to soothe nettle stings, were boiled until they dissolved into a slimy green paste. Yet within this desperation lay remarkable botanical knowledge. Foragers could identify dozens of edible roots, like silverweed and wild parsnip, that grew unnoticed along roadsides. Elderly women, often accused of witchcraft for their herbal expertise, became unexpected lifelines, teaching neighbors which ferns could be eaten if boiled 7 times to remove toxins. In Lincolnshire, records show villagers fermenting fallen apples into vinegar just to get some acidity into their diets. The true tragedy: many of these survival foods accelerated the very starvation they meant to combat. Bark bread caused brutal constipation. Leather broth offered no real nutrition, and the line between hunger suppressants and slow poison blurred, like the thinness tonic sold in Paris markets, made from powdered lead mixed with honey. Yet these acts weren't just about filling bellies, they were about maintaining the illusion of normalcy. A mother serving boiled moss could tell her children it was forest salad, preserving some scrap of dignity in the unrelenting grind of hunger. This scramble for alternative foods reveals a dark truth. Famine didn't just empty stomachs, it emptied categories. What was food? What was medicine? What was poison? In normal times, these lines were clear. But when the grain carts stopped coming, people chewed on pine resin to quiet their growling stomachs and called it supper. The very definition of edible stretched until it snapped. In the shadow of empty granaries, the medieval church became both sanctuary and. Monasteries threw open their gates each morning, serving thin barley gruel from massive cauldrons to lines of hollow-eyed supplicants. This wasn't mere kindness, it was a sacred obligation. Monks recorded how they stretched their own rations to feed hundreds, sometimes fasting for days so a child could have their portion. At Canterbury Cathedral, records show the almoner, the monk in charge of charity, distributed not just food but small coins engraved with crosses, meant to remind the starving that their suffering was seen by God. Yet charity was as much about power as piety. Wealthy merchants donated grain to monasteries not just for salvation, but for influence. In Bruges, the textile magnate Jacob Van funded an entire hospice during the famine of 1346, earning him a seat on the city council the following year. Churches displayed donor names prominently, turning soup lines into advertisements for elite generosity. Some bequests came with strings attached. The Florentine banker, Medici, required paupers to pray for his soul twice daily in exchange for bread. But this system had cracks. When supplies dwindled, monks faced impossible choices. The chronicler Thomas of Burton described how his abbey began mixing sawdust into their charity loaves when barley ran low, only to be mobbed by furious peasants who'd rather starve than eat phantom bread. In London, crowds stormed monasteries accused of hoarding, shouting scripture about the rich man, and even the holiest places weren't immune to desperation. A nun's diary from Normandy tells of catching a starving woman stuffing stolen communion wafers into her shift, not for sacrilege, but because they were the only edible thing left unguarded. The true test came when charity, well, ran dry. In the worst years, monks resorted to symbolic gestures, blessing buckets of acorn paste or handing out strips of parchment with meal vouchers redeemable when God provides. Some churches organized famine processions, marching relics through fields in hopes of divine intervention. The line between compassion and survival blurred completely in places like where abbots traded sacred silver for grain, only to face riots when the food spoiled in transit. What emerges isn't a tidy tale of medieval benevolence, but a raw portrait of moral compromise. A burgher might donate half his wheat one month, then hire guards to keep starving workers from his orchard the next. A priest could preach sharing while locking the tithe barn. Yet in these contradictions, we see something profoundly human: the struggle to maintain virtue when every loaf given away might mean your own child's hunger. The church's real legacy wasn't just the meals it provided, but the agonizing questions it forced society to confront about obligation, privilege, and what happens when faith alone can't fill an empty belly. When the last acorn had been ground into meal, and the tree bark stripped bare, medieval peasants faced a brutal choice: starve where they stood or join the tide of hunger migrants clogging every road to the cities. Chroniclers describe these desperate processions in haunting detail. Fathers carrying children too weak to walk, entire villages reduced to skeletal processions, their feet wrapped in rags as they shuffled toward rumors of food. In the winter of 1314, the monk John of Roads near London, so thick with refugees that travelers had to step over bodies curled in ditches, some still breathing, others frozen mid-plea for bread. Cities became both magnets and mirages. Word would spread that Bristol or Paris had grain stores, sparking mass exoduses from the countryside. But urban gates often slammed shut against the hungry hordes. In Strasbourg during the Great Famine, guards patrolled the walls with orders to turn away anyone without visible means, a policy that created makeshift shantytowns outside every city gate. One heartbreaking account from Ghent describes a mother lowering her infant over the moat in a basket, hoping some kind soul inside would raise it better than she could. For those who made it past the gates, survival meant reinvention. Skilled craftsmen traded tools for food until they had nothing left to sell but themselves. Indenture contracts from the period show weavers and carpenters signing away years of labor for a single sack of rye, sometimes with clauses that bound their children too. The truly destitute turned to organized begging, clustering at church doors with tin badges proving they'd been licensed by authorities. In Siena, the company of the hooded, regulated street begging with military precision, assigning territories and collecting alms to redistribute. Yet this migration reshaped medieval society in unexpected ways. Some cities, like Venice, saw opportunity in the human tide. They welcomed able-bodied migrants as colonists, shipping them to underpopulated territories in exchange for tax breaks. Other towns weaponized hunger. Florence famously lured starving laborers from rival cities during famines, weakening competitors' economies. The darkest twist came when lords realized they could repurchase migrants, abandoned farms for pennies, consolidating lands into vast estates worked by those same desperate souls as serfs. What's rarely acknowledged is how these hunger roads birthed new forms of community. On the move, migrants developed intricate survival networks. Families banded together into traveling hunger clans, sharing scavenged food and standing guard over sleeping children. Old trade routes became informal welfare systems. Blacksmiths repaired pots in exchange for news of which towns still had bakeries operating, while prostitutes bartered secrets about sympathetic monasteries for scraps of cloth. Even the act of walking transformed into a kind of currency, with migrants serving as human couriers, carrying messages between towns in exchange for a night's shelter. The bitter irony: those who survived the journey often found cities nearly as starved as the countryside. London's death records from 1315 show migrant neighborhoods dying at twice the rate of native residents, their bodies piled in strangers' pits outside churchyards. Some never even made it to begging. Contemporary paintings show parents kneeling in market squares with signs around their necks reading, will work for bones. Yet amid this horror, glimmers of resilience persist. Tax records from York reveal clusters of migrant surnames appearing years later as established tradesmen, proof that for all its cruelty, the hunger exodus wasn't just an end, but for some, a terrible new beginning. When official food supplies ran dry, medieval towns didn't just starve quietly, they went underground. Black markets bloomed like poisonous fungi in cellars and back alleys, where a sack of grain could cost a year's wages if you knew the right whispers. In York, court records describe a thriving trade in moonlight flour grains smuggled past city gates under cover of darkness, often by fishermen rowing upriver to avoid toll collectors. But this shadow economy wasn't just about profit. For many, it became a twisted form of justice. When the mayor of Amiens was caught hoarding wheat in 1316, an angry mob didn't just seize his stores. They paraded him through the streets wearing a necklace of moldy bread crusts before banishing him from the city. The line between criminal and hero blurred with every empty stomach. In Lombardy, a miller named became legendary for redirecting his water wheel at night to grind stolen grain for the poor, disguising the noise by having local children sing loudly outside his mill. Belgian ballads still tell of the baker, who adulterated bread with sawdust for wealthy customers, but secretly distributed pure loaves to orphanages. Even the church turned a blind eye to certain sins. Confession records from Toulouse show priests routinely absolving food thieves who stole only what was needed to keep a child alive. But survival crime had a brutal hierarchy. At the bottom were desperate parents snatching cabbages from fields, often losing a hand if caught. Above them operated sophisticated smuggling rings, like the Salt Brothers of Brittany, who moved grain disguised as fishing salt, or the Dead Carters, who pretended to transport corpses in coffins actually packed with cheese and smoked fish. The real masters were the forgers. With bread prices controlled by law, counterfeit ration tokens flooded markets. In Nuremberg, authorities discovered an entire workshop producing fake bakers' seals to mark substandard loaves as regulation quality. What's fascinating is how these illegal acts exposed societal fractures. When a group of Venetian merchants were caught selling rotten grain as famine reserves, the ensuing riot destroyed half the docks, not just because people were hungry, but because the betrayal cut deeper than empty stomachs. Likewise, the widespread practice of ghost milling secretly grinding grain bypassing the Lord's toll wasn't just theft. It was a direct challenge to feudal power structures. Peasants whispering about their hidden hand mills weren't just avoiding taxes, they were rehearsing revolution. Yet black markets also created perverse alliances. Hungry soldiers often turned a blind eye to smugglers in exchange for a cut of the goods. In one startling case from Cologne, a nuns' convent became the hub of an illegal dairy network. Their reputation for piety made them above suspicion as they distributed cheese from concealed cellar vats. Even the wealthy participated, with noble households quietly purchasing black market goods while publicly denouncing grain thieves. The unspoken truth. Everyone knew the system was broken. When the law itself becomes a death sentence, crime stops being a choice and starts looking like common sense. Perhaps the most poignant artifacts are the famine coins, crudely carved wooden tokens found across Europe, used when real currency vanished into hordes. Some bear hopeful slogans like "Spring will come" or shared bread stays sweet. These weren't just tools of exchange. They were proof that even in lawlessness, people clung to the idea of fairness. Because in the end, medieval black markets revealed a terrible truth. When the powerful break their social contract, the hungry will write new rules, with or without permission. Guild halls, normally bustling with the clatter of apprentices and the smell of hot metal, took on a grim new purpose when famine tightened its grip. These weren't just workshops, they became lifelines. The Butchers' Guild in Frankfurt kept a hidden stockpile of smoked meats under their meeting hall floorboards, distributing thin slices to widows of deceased members. The weavers of Ghent turned their communal dye vats into soup cauldrons, boiling scraps of leather and bone into something vaguely nourishing. What made guilds extraordinary wasn't their wealth, it was their structure. Unlike scattered peasants, craftsmen had existing networks of trust, records of who owed whom, and the collective muscle to protect their own. Blacksmiths became accidental bankers in this barter economy. A finely made knife might trade for 3 days' worth of grain one week, then be retraded for a wool blanket the next, its value shifting with each desperate handoff. In Norwich, records show carpenters building chicken coops not for coin, but for promises of future eggs. The Shoemakers' Guild in Cologne developed a chilling side business, crafting tiny burial shoes from scrap leather, accepting payment in whatever food mourners could spare. Even the playthings of wealth became survival tools. Chess sets carved by woodworkers were traded to bored nobles for sacks of apples, while minstrels bartered songs for crusts of bread. This informal economy had its own rules. Goldsmiths, whose trade relied on scarce materials, often fared worst. You can't eat a silver chalice, but their precise weighing skills made them invaluable as mediators in food trades, settling disputes over whether a wedge of cheese was truly worth 2 iron hinges. The parchment makers of Chartres found unexpected demand for their skills, not for books, but for creating famine contracts, crude IOUs that tracked who owed how many turnips or herrings. Some of these documents survive, their edges nibbled by rodents, bearing witness to deals struck in hunger's shadow. What's remarkable is how these tradesmen maintained standards even in. A 1324 guild ledger from Bruges shows master tailors refusing to alter their apprenticeship terms. If a boy couldn't prove he'd stitched a perfect seam, he wouldn't eat from the guild pot, no matter how thin he'd become. This wasn't cruelty, it was about preserving the future. A blacksmith might starve today, but if he trained one more apprentice, the knowledge of making plowshares wouldn't vanish with him. The darkest twist came when guilds turned their collective power against outsiders. In Mainz, the Bakers' Guild paid beggars to stand outside non-guild shops, shouting that their bread contained sawdust, whether true or not. Some crafts became famine specialties. Coopers made barrels specifically for hiding grain, while locksmiths sold ingenious, false-bottom chests to wealthy clients nervous about confiscations. The line between community and cabal blurred completely in places like where the Tanners' Guild ran a thriving black market in horsemeat, disguising it as mutton with clever spicing. Yet these networks also birthed odd moments of grace. When the stonemasons' guild in Salisbury realized their stockpile of limestone dust could be mixed with ground bark to make passable famine cement, they didn't hoard the knowledge. They traded the recipe to neighboring towns for whatever food could be spared. In Venice, glassmakers whose furnaces had gone cold repurposed their annealing ovens to slowly roast chestnuts, creating a smoky delicacy that became currency itself. Even the humblest crafts found new value. Basket weavers taught children to make traps for sparrows, while potters shaped crude bowls specifically for boiling nettles. These adaptations reveal a truth more profound than mere survival. When money becomes meaningless, skill becomes the last real currency. A cobbler's hands might shake from hunger, but if he could still turn scraps into shoes, he had leverage in a crumbling world. The guilds didn't just preserve crafts through famine. They proved that human ingenuity, when pooled together, could outlast even the winters. Their ledgers from those years tell two stories, one of dwindling supplies and crossed-out names, but also of margins filled with strange new recipes, barter rates, and the occasional hopeful note, "Remember to plant the apple seeds." Because survival wasn't just about getting through today. It was about ensuring someone would still know how to make a barrel, stitch a tunic, or forge a plow when spring finally came. Women's hands shaped the hidden economy of famine. While official records fixated on grain shortages and market prices, it was the relentless labor of ordinary women that stitched communities together, sometimes literally. In damp cottages and muddy lanes, they transformed scraps into survival. A tattered cloak became a child's winter coat with careful patching. Spoiled grain, deemed unfit for bread, fermented into weak, small ale that at least provided calories and safer drinking than contaminated wells. Even the act of foraging became gendered. Women knew which wild greens could thicken a broth without causing cramps, which tree barks could be pounded into something resembling flour. Their knowledge, passed mother to daughter, often meant the difference between a family that starved and one that scraped by. But this labor was more than domestic. It was economic warfare. When grain prices soared, women's anger boiled over first. In the summer of 1320, the women of Ypres stormed the grain carts with distaffs and kitchen knives, their aprons becoming makeshift sacks to carry seized wheat. Similar scenes played out across Europe. The bread wives of who organized price boycotts, the Parisian laundresses who turned their washing bats into weapons against corrupt bakers. These weren't random riots. They were calculated strikes against a system that undervalued women's work even as it relied on it. A widow might spend hours unraveling old hose to reknit into sellable stockings, only to earn half what a man got for the same labor. The injustice fermented like bad ale until it spilled into the streets. The darkest adaptations reveal how famine warped morality. Church records from Norwich describe mothers sending daughters as young as 12 to walk the tanner's lane, trading the only commodity they had left. Yet even here, women found ways to resist. Some brothel keepers in London secretly ran networks to smuggle food to families of their workers. In Cologne, a group of sex workers pooled earnings to buy grain for a communal oven, baking coarse loaves, stamped with a rose. Their silent rebuke to a society that pretended not to see their hunger. What's often overlooked is how women weaponized domestic skills. Already experts in herbal remedies became famine apothecaries, brewing pine needle tea for scurvy or teaching mothers to rub nettle paste on starving children's gums to ease pain. Spinners didn't just make thread. They twisted old candle wicks into fishing lines to catch minnows. Even the humble distaff became a tool of defiance. Women in Flanders spun flax on their doorsteps to monitor grain shipments, ready to sound the alarm at any sign of hoarding. The irony: these same women who kept societies functioning were first to be blamed when famine's grip tightened. Town chronicles accused hysterical wives of causing panic when they demanded fair prices. Priests preached against the greed of market women who bartered too shrewdly. Yet when the dust settled, it was women's names that vanished from the records. No statues for the alewives who fed entire neighborhoods. No guild plaques for the seamstresses who turned rags into blankets. Their legacy survives only in fragments. A recipe for acorn pancakes scribbled in a prayer book's margin. A court transcript where a baker admits lowering prices, lest they return with their knives again. Perhaps the most telling artifact is a child's doll found in a German peat bog, its body stuffed not with wool, but with dried pea pods. Some mother somewhere had salvaged every edible scrap and still found a way to make her daughter a toy. That quiet act of love amidst devastation says more about women's famine labor than any ledger ever could. Because survival wasn't just about filling stomachs, it was about preserving the fragile belief that a world worth living in still existed, even if you had to stitch it together from scraps. The cries of hungry children cut through medieval towns like a knife, a sound no amount of hardship could fully muffle. When famine's shadow lengthened, families faced impossible choices with their youngest. Monasteries became reluctant orphanages, their gates besieged by parents clutching infants they could no longer feed. In Winchester, records show monks accepting children as young as 4 with nothing, but a wooden cross tied around their necks as identification. These weren't adoptions, but desperate transactions. Some parents promising annual payments of eggs or wool if they ever recovered enough to reclaim their sons and daughters. The luckiest children became oblates, destined for religious life. The rest joined the army of tiny servants scrubbing floors and hauling water, their small hands traded for regular meals. Yet convents and abbeys turned away far more than they took. For every child admitted, a dozen more wandered the streets in packs, their ribs visible through thin shirts. Town mortality rolls from the Great Famine list them euphemistically as the little sleepers' bodies found curled in alleys or abandoned barns, often clutching makeshift toys. In A Heartbreaking Account describes a boy no older than 7 discovered frozen near the docks with his pockets full of mussel shells, the only food he'd found in days. Some deaths went unrecorded entirely. Infants buried secretly in vegetable plots or slipped into rivers by parents unable to face another mouth to feed. But childhood in famine wasn't just passive suffering. It was a crash course in survival. Quick fingers and small bodies became assets. Children wriggled through bakery windows to steal crusts, or pretended to play while scavenging fallen grain near mill wheels. In coastal towns, boys dove for oysters in freezing water, while girls perfected the art of apron gleaning, shaking nearly bare wheat stalks so skillfully that a few precious kernels collected in their skirts. Some formed elaborate distraction teams, one group singing loudly to cover the rustle of others raiding orchards. The line between mischief and necessity blurred completely in places like Arras, where street urchins developed a whole thieves' cant for food-related crimes, calling stolen cheese angel bricks and rotten apples widow's gold. The cruelty lay in how famine every childhood inequality. Wealthy households sometimes took in peasant children as servants, not from charity, but because hunger made them cheap labor. A Frankfurt merchant's ledger lists a 9-year-old girl purchased for 2 bushels of rye and a worn cloak. These children often fared better than their free counterparts, at least receiving gruel and a straw pallet, but their servitude could stretch indefinitely. Meanwhile, the offspring of skilled craftsmen had hidden advantages. A cooper's son might trade repaired buckets for milk, while a scribe's daughter could barter letter writing for scraps. What's rarely acknowledged is how famine rewrote the very concept of childhood. Play persisted even in starvation, though transformed. Digging sticks became pretend in dirt where real crops wouldn't grow. Little girls sewed dolls from thistle heads and cobwebs, whispering to them about feasts they'd never tasted. In one poignant archaeological find from York, a child's grave contained not toys, but 6 carefully arranged pebbles, likely used as counting tokens in some desperate game of market barter. These small acts of imagination weren't just escape. They were rehearsals for a future these children weren't sure would come. The bitterest truth: some children outlived the famine only to bear its scars forever. Growth stunted by malnutrition made survivors noticeably shorter, a biological record of hunger etched into bones. Girls who reached womanhood often struggled with childbirth, their pelvises narrowed by childhood starvation. Many carried psychological wounds too, like the man in a Siena court record who, decades later, still hoarded bread under his bed despite owning a prosperous vineyard. Yet amidst this devastation flickered resilience, like the orphaned brothers in Ghent, who turned their scavenging skills into a thriving rag-picking business. Or the girl who entered a nunnery at 6 and emerged decades later as its famed herbalist, her childhood knowledge of famine weeds now saving lives. Famine didn't just steal children's food, it stole their innocence, their growth, sometimes their very names from the records. But in their stubborn games, their secret stashes, their fierce loyalty to younger siblings, these children whispered back to history that they were more than victims. They were the smallest soldiers in humanity's oldest war, the battle against empty bellies and broken tomorrows. When hunger gnawed at medieval towns, the physicians who stepped forward wielded remedies as dangerous as the famine itself. Trained in ancient texts that blamed disease on miasma, bad air rising from swamps, they prescribed bloodletting to balance humors, unaware they were draining strength from bodies already wasting away. In Lincoln, one doctor's ledger from 1322 lists 37 famine patients bled with leeches, 23 of whom died within weeks. Even more cruelly, some monastic healers recommended therapeutic fasting, believing starvation purified the soul. At Abbey, monks recorded giving thirsty children vinegar-soaked cloths to suck on, a brutal cure meant to suppress appetites they couldn't satisfy. The physical toll of malnutrition, medieval understanding. Scurvy, unknown to be a vitamin deficiency, made gums bleed and teeth loosen, leading physicians to diagnose the creeping sickness as demonic possession. Edema, where starving bodies retain fluid until limbs swell grotesquely, was misinterpreted as dropsy, a sign of excess rather than deprivation. A Parisian doctor's journal describes wrapping swollen legs in cabbage leaves, oblivious that the real treatment lay in the convent gardens outside his window. Those herb plots, tended by nuns with generations of plant lore, grew scurvy-fighting parsley, watercress, and sorrel, nutrients that saved countless lives, even as learned men dismissed such remedies as peasant superstition. Yet within this tragic ignorance, flickered moments of accidental wisdom. Monastery infirmaries became inadvertent nutrition labs, where monks noted that patients given beer made from sprouted barley, rich in B vitamins, regained strength faster. Excluded from formal medicine, preserved life-saving knowledge like feeding anemia sufferers iron-rich nettle soup or rubbing swollen bellies with dandelion poultices to reduce fluid retention. Even the much-mocked urine wheels used by some doctors had a grain of truth dark. Concentrated urine really did signal dehydration, though the prescribed prayers did little to help. The bitterest irony lay in how famine exposed medicine's class divide. Wealthy patients received expensive cures like powdered pearl or gold leaf, believed to strengthen the heart, while the poor made do with whatever grew wild. A merchant's account from Cologne records purchasing a single saffron thread, thought to ward off plague, for the price of a laborer's weekly bread ration. Yet sometimes, privilege proved deadly. Nobles who could afford imported sugar suffered worse tooth decay and diabetes, while peasants chewing on pine resin for hunger pains inadvertently benefited from its antiseptic properties. What emerges isn't just a tale of medieval ignorance, but a sobering lesson about the limits of knowledge. When the Black Death followed famines, killing even the healthiest, it shattered remaining faith in academic medicine. People turned instead to a patchwork of solutions: apothecaries, herbs, tonics, and their own grim observations. A chronicle from Avignon captures this shift. After watching his 7th patient die from bloodletting, a young physician threw his lancet into the river and began dispensing garlic and honey instead. Sometimes, survival didn't require understanding why something worked, only that it did. In the end, the real medicine was whatever kept you alive until the next harvest, whether approved by a university or whispered over by a grandmother who remembered the last great hunger. Even the iron fist of feudalism could loosen when hunger threatened to ignite rebellion. Lords who normally demanded every last bushel of grain sometimes became reluctant benefactors, not from sudden compassion, but from cold calculation. In the winter of 1318, the Count of Flanders famously opened his granaries after peasants arrived at his gates with scythes and torches rather than empty hands. This wasn't charity, it was political triage. Records from Burgundy show manorial courts hastily canceling debts when more than half a village's men had fled or died, realizing dead peasants paid no taxes at all. The parchment trail of these negotiations reveals surprising nuance. Some lords offered hunger loans advances of seed grain to be repaid after the next harvest, though many knew full well those debts would never be collected. In Suffolk, a monastery's account book lists 16 families forgiven their wool tithes in exchange for maintaining the abbey's fish ponds, turning feudal obligations into a barter system. What's fascinating are the peasant strategies behind these concessions. Village elders would send their most articulate members, often millers or blacksmiths who interacted regularly with lords, to plead their case armed not with threats, but with pragmatic appeals. A petition from Normandy argues eloquently that starving serfs couldn't possibly harvest next year's crops, framing relief as an investment in the lord's own future wealth. But this system had its hypocrisies. The same lord who waived taxes one season might demand double the following year to recoup losses. In Lombardy, Nobles pioneered a cruel form of famine insurance. Peasants could borrow grain at planting time, but owed threefold if the harvest failed. Some monasteries played both sides, distributing alms while quietly buying up defaulted farms for pennies. Yet even these grim transactions created unexpected opportunities. A serf in Provence managed to negotiate his family's freedom by offering to clear a patch of blight-infected land no one else would touch. Proving desperation could sometimes bend feudalism's rigid rules. The darkest irony: some of the most generous lords were simply repaying stolen abundance. Tax records from the Loire Valley show noble estates stockpiling enough grain to feed entire regions during good years, only to release it at inflated prices when famine struck. What looked like benevolence was often just profiteering in disguise. Yet these moments still mattered. Whether motivated by fear or fleeting conscience, they proved even the medieval world's harshest hierarchies weren't immutable. When the alternative was watching their workforce die or revolt, even the most callous lord might discover the virtues of compromise, at least until the next harvest came in. Hunger did more than hollow out bodies, it rewired minds. Medieval chronicles speak of famine madness, a haunting transformation where desperation erased moral boundaries. In the winter of 1316, a priest near Trier described villagers digging up graves not for treasure, but for something far darker, gnawing hunger turning neighbors into predators. Yet these extreme acts weren't the whole story. For every account of cannibalism, there were 10 of quiet endurance, mothers giving their last morsels to children while whispering psalms, old men surrendering their burial shrouds to wrap starving infants. This stark duality, despair and devotion, became the lens through which societies processed famine's trauma long after the fields turned green again. Religion offered both salve and scourge. Some saw starvation as divine punishment, flagellating themselves in muddy processions to atone for imagined sins. In Lincolnshire, a group of peasants reportedly lived on nothing but communion wafers and rainwater for weeks, convinced God would sustain them like the Israelites with manna. Others turned faith into defiance, like the women of who stripped the gold leaf from a saint's statue to trade for grain, declaring the blessed would rather feed living children than blind eyes. Churches became stages for this psychological drama, where the same altar that distributed charity bread might later host a sermon blaming famine on collective moral failure. The way communities remembered these experiences reveals deeper fractures. Town chronicles from prosperous regions often emphasized tales of resilience, miraculous springs appearing, shared meals binding neighbors closer. But records from harder-hit areas dwelled on shame. A father trading his daughter for a sack of flour, a monk caught stealing cheese from orphans. These weren't just facts, they were moral judgments. When the scribe of Reims wrote about a woman who killed her sister over a crust of bread, he added, "May God have mercy on her soul," but the very act of recording it ensured her damnation in collective memory. What's rarely acknowledged is how famine reshaped language itself. The word hunger split into shades of meaning: bread hunger for physical need, heart hunger for the despair of watching loved ones waste away. Parents gave newborns names like Enduring or Rock, hoping to armor them against future suffering. Even food descriptions changed. A surviving cookbook from Normandy crosses out peasant stew and renames it Hope Pottage, as if words could soften reality's edges. The most enduring psychological scar was the erosion of trust. Diaries from the period describe neighbors who'd shared fences for decades suddenly eyeing each other's vegetable plots with suspicion. In one heartbreaking court case from York, a man against his own brother for stealing turnips, not out of anger, but because famine had made betrayal feel inevitable. Yet against this bleakness, tiny acts of kindness glimmered like sparks in ash. A merchant's ledger from Bruges lists a single line: "Given to the blind beggar, one herring daily though accounts are bare." No explanation, just a quiet refusal to let hunger extinguish empathy completely. Famine didn't just test bodies, it became a referendum on what it meant to stay human. Those who broke under its weight were often remembered more vividly than those who endured, not because their actions defined the era, but because they forced survivors to ask, "Would I have done differently?" The answer, whispered in midnight prayers or etched into confessional records, shaped medieval society's conscience for generations. In the end, the psychology of starvation wasn't about extremes of good and evil, but about the fragile space between them, where most people clung, day after terrible day, to whatever version of themselves hunger hadn't yet taken. Amidst the gnawing emptiness of famine, something peculiar happened: music. In town squares where beggars clutched hollow stomachs, trumpets suddenly blared. Tables appeared, draped in threadbare linens that couldn't hide their stains. These weren't the lavish banquets of prosperous years, but hunger feasts, bizarre performances of abundance where the wealthy gnawed on roasted songbirds while distributing thin soup to the starving crowd. The Bishop of Rouen hosted such an event in 1321, recording proudly that 300 souls were fed, though his own kitchen accounts reveal the feast was mostly watered ale and bread so stale it had to be dunked to chew. Why celebrate when the granaries echoed hollow? For elites, these spectacles were power plays wrapped in piety. A lord throwing even a meager banquet demonstrated he still controlled food, and by extension, the lives of those who watched him eat. In Milan, the family famously staged a 12 dishes of Lent feast during famine, serving elaborate presentations of root vegetables carved to resemble meat, a cruel pantomime of plenty. Yet for the desperate, these events offered something darker, a shred of normalcy. A chronicler in Ghent describes peasants dancing stiffly to minstrel songs after receiving their rations, their movements sluggish from hunger, but their voices eerily bright. It wasn't joy, it was the relief of remembering what joy had once felt like. The menus of these feasts read like tragic poetry. In Norwich, a harvest celebration during crop failures featured loaves made from ground bean pods and acorns, stamped with the town seal to dignify their wretchedness. Parisian butchers hosted bone banquets, boiling the same cattle skeletons for days to extract every speck of marrow before handing the greasy broth to attendees. Some rituals twisted into grotesque parody, like the mock King of Fools procession in Cologne, where a beggar crowned with wilted cabbage leaves was paraded through streets, while onlookers laughed through tears. What's most revealing is what happened after the music faded. Kitchen records from these events show startling discrepancies. While commoners received thin gruel, the hosts, private chambers concealed smoked meats and spiced wines. In York, a baker's confession reveals he was ordered to make 2 sets of bread rolls for famine feasts, hearty ones for the high table and near-empty ones for the crowd, baked with extra salt to make recipients thirstier for the free ale, itself diluted with river water. The cruelty wasn't incidental, it was the point. These weren't acts of charity, but theater designed to highlight who still held power when the social contract frayed. Yet in their own twisted way, these festivals kept civilization's embers glowing. The very act of gathering, of singing the old songs, however weakly, asserted that some rules still held. A starving peasant might clutch their wooden bowl of nettle soup and hear a familiar hymn, and for a moment, believe the world hadn't completely unraveled. That fragile belief, however manipulated by the powerful, sometimes proved as nourishing as the food itself. Because when every day is a calculation of survival, pretending, even briefly, that life could still include music and laughter wasn't just delusion. It was defiance. When famine's grip tightened, the fate of animals mirrored their human keepers in heartbreaking ways. Barns that once echoed with the lowing of oxen fell silent as farmers made the grim calculation, slaughtering their plow teams before winter to save precious fodder. Records from Lincolnshire show entire villages entering spring without a single draft animal, forcing men and women to harness themselves to plows like beasts. The loss rippled beyond fields. Without oxen to turn mill wheels, grain couldn't be ground, leaving families chewing raw wheat kernels that tore their gums. Even prized dairy cows vanished from buyers, their milk replaced by thin broths made from boiled bones. Yet the disappearance of pets tells the most haunting tale. Church court documents from Normandy describe sudden spikes in stray dog complaints, though everyone knew these weren't strays, just beloved hounds abandoned to fend for themselves. Some owners tied ribbons around their dogs' necks before turning them loose, a silent plea for someone kinder to take them in. More disturbing are the gaps in records where cats should be. Unlike dogs, few felines were formally abandoned because their value shifted overnight. As rats overran granaries, towns paid bounties for dead rodents, and cats, once tolerated as mousers, became prized hunters. A single skilled tabby could earn its keep by delivering a dozen rats per night to the grain warden's doorstep. This created a macabre ecosystem. Cats grew fat on the very vermin that thrived on spilled grain, their populations booming even as humans starved. In York, archaeologists found 14th century cat skeletons with bones nearly twice as thick as pre-famine specimens, evidence of protein-rich diets. Meanwhile, the rats themselves underwent strange transformations. Chroniclers noted the emergence of grain wolves, unusually large rodents that grew bold enough to steal food directly from children's hands. Some towns employed rat catchers not with traps, but with terriers trained to ignore their own hunger and bring back every kill unmauled for inspection. The twist, animals that survived often outlived their purpose. When spring finally came, villages that had slaughtered their oxen faced fields they couldn't plow. Some turned to desperate measures. Bavarian records describe farmers attempting to train cows to the plow, while coastal communities hitched fishing boats to drag harrows across sandy soils. As for the cats, their boom turned to bust when rodent populations crashed. Mass drownings of felines appear in town expense logs shortly after famines ended, a chilling postscript to their temporary usefulness. What lingers in these stories isn't just the suffering, but the uncomfortable parallels. Like their human counterparts, animals were categorized as useful or disposable based on famine's ruthless calculus. A hunting dog that once brought down deer might be butchered for soup, while a scrawny alley cat became a town's most valued resident overnight. These choices reveal the raw hierarchy of survival, where even loyalty and love bowed before the relentless arithmetic of empty bellies. Water sources became, during famine years, their purity as vital as any loaf of bread. When drought baked the land, medieval wells turned treacherous, shallow pits where stagnant water bred invisible killers. In the summer of 1312, the chronicler Henry of Hereford described villagers drinking from a green-scummed pond, their lips cracking with thirst even as their bellies swelled with dysentery. Contamination spread faster than gossip. One spoiled well could doom an entire parish. Towns along the Rhine reported families dropping dead within hours of drinking river water, thick with sewage and tannery runoff. Their last moments spent in violent spasms as cholera tore through their guts. But necessity breeds invention like rot breeds flies. Some communities responded with startling sophistication. In the limestone hills of Burgundy, villagers carved famine cisterns deep, bell-shaped reservoirs lined with clay to filter rainwater. These weren't crude pits, but feats of engineering, with tiered shelves for sediment to settle and woven reed mats to strain debris. Records from Siena show officials hiring water witches, not magical figures, but elderly women who could locate hidden springs by observing which way mice dug or where certain plants thrived. Their knowledge, passed through generations, became priceless when surface water vanished. The most desperate solutions reveal how famine warped priorities. In coastal Norwich, families drank seawater mixed with vinegar, though it burned their throats and worsened dehydration. London's poor famously gathered at Stinking Lane to collect runoff from brewery vats, preferring beer-tainted liquid over the open sewers they called rivers. Monastic infirmaries became early water treatment centers, where monks boiled suspect water with silver coins, unknowingly exploiting the metal's antibacterial properties, or filtered it through layers of charcoal and sand. What's tragic is how preventable many deaths were. The same towns that built towering cathedrals often neglected basic sanitation until crisis struck. A physician's journal from Cologne laments watching nobles argue over well rights, while peasants died drinking from puddles where pigs wallowed. Yet even in this neglect, glimmers of progress emerged. After the Great Famine, some Italian cities mandated tiled public fountains with constant flow to prevent stagnation. In France, laws required tanners to dump waste downstream of drinking zones, early and uneven steps toward public health. The real lesson lies not in the suffering, but in the patterns that emerged. Communities with shared water sources often fared better than those divided by private wells, proving once again that cooperation outlasted individualism. A single clean spring could become the heart of a village's survival strategy, guarded day and night, rationed by need rather than wealth. Its keepers celebrated in folk songs long after the famine passed. Because when every drop carried the threat of death, water wasn't just a resource. It was a mirror reflecting who people chose to be at their most desperate, hoarders or guardians, schemers or saviors. Winter crept into medieval towns with a cruelty that reshaped survival itself. While summer's droughts and autumn's failed harvests brought hunger, winter delivered a deeper torment, the slow, silent siege of cold. Frozen fields weren't just barren. They became mocking mirrors of what might have been, the hard earth refusing even the most desperate attempts to scratch out late crops. roads iced over into impassable ribbons, cutting off not just trade, but hope. No grain carts would rumble into town until spring thaw, no matter how many coins were offered. In the Alps, entire villages vanished under avalanches, their existence erased until some traveler in May stumbled upon a chimney poking through snowdrifts, the last marker of lives interrupted. The cold rewrote the rules of thrift. What passed for frugality in autumn, saving chair legs for kindling, hoarding rags as insulation, became stark necessity when temperatures plummeted. A chronicle from Burgundy describes families burning bed frames first, then doors, then finally the wooden hinges themselves, leaving homes gaping open to the wind. In London, court records show paupers prosecuted for stealing church pews, not out of sacrilege, but because the wax-soaked wood burned longer than damp firewood. The wealthy weren't spared either. Manor accounts list nobles sending servants to strip bark from ancient oaks in their own parks, the very symbols of their lineage sacrificed to keep nurseries warm. Yet winter's deadliest weapon wasn't the cold itself, but the way it every other hardship. Starving bodies, already weakened, succumbed to frostbite with horrifying speed. A physician's journal from Prague describes peasant children whose fingers blackened and fell off after gathering firewood barehanded, their families too poor to spare gloves for work that might earn a single log. Malnutrition made wounds fester where healthy bodies might heal. A splinter from chopping frozen wood could spiral into gangrene without enough food to fuel recovery. Even shelter became treacherous. Thatched roofs, normally excellent insulators, turned lethal when starving rats nested inside, their gnawing weakening supports until ceilings collapsed under snow loads. The season created cruel paradoxes. Ice fishing should have been a lifeline, but lakes froze so thick that cutting holes required tools many had already melted down for scrap metal. Snow, theoretically a water source, often carried frost-poison medieval slang for the debilitating diarrhea caused by eating unclean snow when no fuel existed to boil it. Some communities developed grim innovations, like the peat beds of Flanders, where families slept buried in partially burned peat moss, its lingering warmth staving off hypothermia at the cost of lungs filled with acrid smoke. What's most haunting is how winter warped time itself. Daylight shrank to a few precious hours, turning any task, fetching water, foraging into a race against darkness. The wealthy marked Advent with feasts, but for the poor, December to February was one long vigil, counting not days but remaining food stores. A nun's diary from Normandy records her order's practice of tying knots in a rope each morning, untying one only if they'd eaten, leaving the rest as a visual count of rations left. This wasn't just tracking. It was psychological armor against the temptation to eat tomorrow's portion today. Yet even here, humanity flickered. In the mountains, villagers practiced chain-breathing, crowding into smoke huts so each person's exhalations warmed their neighbor. Alpine monasteries sent monks to sing down the cold, chanting through the night so shepherds on distant slopes would know they weren't alone. And when the thaw finally came, the first green shoots weren't just food. They were proof that survival, however fragile, had been won again. Because winter didn't just test medieval people's ability to endure cold. It tested their belief that spring would ever come. Hunger wears down patience like a millstone grinds grain, slowly, relentlessly, until something finally cracks. When the last crust vanished from market stalls and children's cries pierced the night air, medieval towns didn't always bow their heads in prayer. Sometimes they reached for pitchforks. The year 1381 didn't just bring the peasants' revolt to England's doorstep. It exposed the raw nerve connecting empty bellies to political upheaval. Wat Tyler's rebels didn't march on London over abstract ideals of freedom. They were veterans of 100 hungry nights, men who'd watched their families chew on boiled leather, while abbey granaries bulged with untouchable harvests. Their battle cry when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, wasn't philosophy. It was the roar of people who'd realized starvation wasn't fate, but theft. Bread riots followed a brutal logic all their own. Unlike organized revolts, these explosions of rage were usually leaderless, spontaneous, a spark hitting tinder. In 13th century Ypres, a mob of women stormed the grain market not with weapons, but with their bare hands and aprons turned into makeshift sacks. French chronicles describe similar scenes during the Great Famine, where starving workers didn't bother with speeches. They simply tore the bolts from bakers' ovens and passed steaming loaves hand to hand like communion wafers. What made these moments dangerous to the powerful wasn't just the violence, but the symbolism. A castle could withstand siege, but when commoners smashed the very ovens meant to feed them, that was society eating its own tail. The anatomy of these uprisings reveals how hunger dissolved fear. Normally, the sight of a lord's armored retainers would scatter peasants like birds. But famine altered that calculus. What was there left to lose? In the German town of during the famine of 1310, weavers armed with their heavy wooden battens, normally used to beat cloth, overwhelmed guards at the bishop's granary. Their prize, not gold or jewels, but sacks of moldy rye even the bishop's pigs had refused. That's the haunting truth of these rebellions. They weren't about greed, but the bare minimum for survival. Yet authorities often responded with a blindness that bordered on suicide. After the revolt in Florence, sparked by wool workers starving while their employers exported grain, the city's elites executed the ringleaders, then immediately raised taxes on bread. The message was clear. Obedience mattered more than full stomachs. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a catastrophic misreading of human nature. Because when you push people past the point where death seems preferable to slow starvation, you don't get submission. You get the Jacquerie of 1358, where French peasants didn't just demand food, they burned manor houses with the lords still inside. What's often overlooked is how these explosions of violence left lasting scars on both sides. Survivors' accounts describe rioters who wept as they looted, their fury mixed with shame at breaking lifelong taboos. A Parisian baker's journal from 1316 tells of watching his shop get ransacked by neighbors he'd known since childhood, then secretly leaving loaves outside their homes weeks later when the ringleaders were hanged. These weren't faceless mobs, but communities torn apart by impossible choices. The irony, many rebellions succeeded in the short term only to fail in the long game. After the English peasants' revolt, King Richard II initially agreed to abolish serfdom, then revoked his promise the moment the armies dispersed. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Lords might still hold the land, but they'd seen the specter of what happens when hunger meets hopelessness. Tax records from the decades after major revolts show subtle changes: lower grain tithes, more investment in famine reserves, a new wariness about pushing tenants too far. Because while castles could withstand many things, as the 14th century proved again and again, the collective rage of the hungry was not one of them. The empty hearths of abandoned villages told only part of the story after famine's shadow lifted. Some settlements, like those in England's Wessex region, simply vanished from tax rolls, their last inhabitants either buried in overgrown churchyards or scattered to windswept roads. Archaeologists still uncover their traces. A child's wooden doll half-rotted in a collapsed cottage, a rusted plowshare left mid-field where some starving farmer finally dropped it. Yet other towns emerged from the crucible transformed. In the Rhineland, villagers who once grew wheat switched to hardier rye, its dark stalks better resisting the erratic weather patterns that now defined their world. This wasn't just crop rotation, it was agricultural reinvention, a grudging admission that the old ways had failed them. Demographic earthquakes rumbled for decades after the last hunger winter. Regions like Burgundy saw entire valleys depopulated, their terraced vineyards reclaimed by wild grasses as survivors clustered around fortified towns. Meanwhile, cities like Nuremberg swelled with newcomers, not just the usual craftsmen and merchants, but gaunt-faced peasants clutching deeds to abandoned farms they traded for a chance at regular meals. The very fabric of communities unraveled and rewove itself. A church record from Saxony lists 7 weddings in a single month between formerly rival villages, their ancient feuds forgotten when hunger made isolation fatal. Land ownership tilted on its axis in ways that would shape Europe for centuries. Monasteries, often the only institutions with reserves to buy up failed farms, became sprawling latifundia, their abbots now lords of vast territories worked by tenants who'd once owned those same fields. In Tuscany, merchant families like the Medici turned grain crises into opportunities, snapping up vineyards for pennies and creating the wine estates that would later fund their banking empires. The twist: some serfs who survived found themselves bound to lands they'd once owned freely, their hunger debts converted into generational bondage through carefully worded contracts. The most enduring changes were invisible to the eye. Stunted growth patterns visible in skeletal remains show children of the Great Famine averaging 2 inches shorter than their parents, a biological scar passed to their own descendants. Folk songs mutated too, where once they celebrated harvests, now they warned of the lean years in minor keys. Even language bore famine's imprint. The English word starveling entered common use, while German dialects added phrases like hunger lines to describe the permanent wrinkles left on survivors' faces. Yet resilience flickered in unexpected places. Some villages, like those in the Swiss Alps, developed intricate food storage systems, communal granaries built into mountainsides where constant cold preserved harvests for years. Others reinvented themselves entirely. The fishing hamlet of its fields ruined by floods turned wholeheartedly to herring curing and emerged wealthier than before. These adaptations weren't just practical. They represented a psychological shift, a hard-won understanding that survival meant bending without breaking. Because the true legacy of medieval famines wasn't just empty villages or altered diets. It was the dawning realization that security lay not in tradition, but in the painful, necessary art of change. The forest might seem like a lifeline during famine, until you've stripped its bark bare. Rural peasants had space to forage, but medieval woodlands weren't endless supermarkets. A family could exhaust a stand of edible ferns within days, and streams once teeming with fish soon ran empty under relentless nets. Country dwellers did have one brutal advantage: they knew hunger's rhythm. Generations of scarcity taught them to spot early blight on wheat stalks, to dry mushrooms in summer for winter soups, and to cache acorns in clay pots like squirrels. Yet these skills meant little when entire regions starved. A diary from the Black Forest describes villagers digging up anthills to sift for stored seeds, their arms swollen with bites, only to find the ants had eaten everything first. Towns offered different traps and lifelines. The marketplace might have bread today, but at prices that made coins feel useless. A craftsman's widow in Bruges reportedly sold her late husband's tools for a single loaf, only to watch prices double by week's end. Yet urban centers held hidden networks country folk lacked. Guilds enforced price controls, however weakly. Monasteries ran soup kitchens, and neighbors bartered skills. A cobbler might trade shoe repairs for a butcher's. London's records show watermen ferrying scavenged coal to bakehouses in exchange for burned loaves. The charred rejects too ugly to sell. This fragile web of exchange kept some townspeople alive long after isolated farms had given up. The difference lay in visibility. A starving peasant family could vanish silently into the woods, their empty cottage reclaimed by brambles. But urban hunger was a public spectacle. Leper colonies outside York reported crowds of healthy beggars pretending to be sick just to get the daily bread ration. Wealthy townsfolk stepping over bodies in the street couldn't claim ignorance like absentee lords. This pressure sometimes spurred action. The Bishop of Winchester famously sold his silver chalices to buy Flemish grain after seeing children lick mortar off walls for the lime's scant minerals. Yet both worlds were bound in a deadly embrace. Villagers fled to towns seeking food, only to overcrowd them and spread disease. Urban grain ships emptied the countryside's stores, leaving farmers without seed for next year. The real lesson of this divide: survival wasn't about choosing the better option, but navigating both systems' fractures. A Sussex shepherd might drive his last sheep to town for slaughter, trading meat for salt to preserve the next carcass, only to return home and find his pastures overrun by foraging townsfolk. The medieval world learned the hard way. Hunger ignored borders, and no one starved alone. When the crops withered and children's bellies swelled with hunger, medieval priests faced a crisis of explanation. From pulpits across Europe, a chilling refrain echoed. Famine was divine wrath made manifest. In the Diocese of Mainz during the Great Famine, Bishop ordered weekly penitent processions, barefoot, lashing themselves with knotted ropes as they chanted psalms of atonement. Town criers declared the disaster's punishment for collective sin. Sabbath breaking, greed, even the vanity of women's elaborate headdresses. This wasn't just theology, it was social control wielded like a scythe. Peasants who might have blamed their lord's grain hoarding now turned inward, scrutinizing their neighbors for the moral failings that had brought God's displeasure. Yet not all clergy wielded hunger as a blunt instrument of fear. In the quiet corners of monastic scriptoria, alternative interpretations took root. The mystic wrote of famines as God's refiner's fire, trials meant to burn away earthly attachments rather than punish. Her vision resonated in surprising places, like the Italian city of Siena, where friars distributed bread stamped with crosses, calling it manna for the faithful. This softer approach didn't fill bellies, but it offered something equally vital: hope. Where fire and brimstone preachers saw divine anger, these pastors framed suffering as sacred endurance. They're not sinners, but job-like figures being tested. The tension between these views tore communities apart. In Normandy, a peasant uprising began not with grain seizures, but with the public burning of a sermon scroll declaring famine God's will. Meanwhile, Flanders witnessed devout women called bread saints voluntarily sharing their rations while quoting Christ's words on the cross, turning starvation into performance of piety. The same disaster could inspire guilt or grace depending on who held the pulpit. A single village might harbor both a priest who blamed famine on witchcraft and another who saw it as nature's indifference, leaving parishioners caught between cosmic justice and cruel chance. These conflicting interpretations had very real consequences. Towns that embraced the punishment narrative often scapegoated minorities. Jewish communities in the Rhineland were falsely accused of poisoning wells during famines, leading to massacres. Conversely, regions emphasizing faith's test developed remarkable mutual aid systems. The chronicler Thomas of described Belgian villages where families left surplus turnips on communal mercy tables, trusting God would reward their generosity. Both responses sought meaning in suffering, but one bred division while the other wove fragile nets of solidarity. What's rarely acknowledged is how these religious frameworks served temporal power. A lord whose fields lay fallow might donate grain to the local abbey, not just for heavenly favor, but because monks controlled the narrative. When the Bishop of Winchester preached that famine proved the divine right of kings, he wasn't offering spiritual comfort. He was ensuring hungry peasants wouldn't question why royal storehouses remained locked. Yet even here, subversion flickered. Folk carols from the period mock corrupt priests, whose bellies shake like jelly, while their flock starves, proving medieval people could spot holy hypocrisy when it wore a golden cross. Perhaps the most poignant legacy lies in the artifacts of private faith. Excavated peasant cottages yield makeshift altars with offerings of acorns and withered herbs, not the grand theology of cathedral clerics, but a quiet insistence that the divine still owed them something. Because whether framed as punishment or test, these beliefs weren't just about explaining hunger. They were about enduring it with some shred of dignity intact, the stubborn conviction that even in starvation, one's suffering might still mean something. When the fields failed, medieval towns turned their eyes to the horizon, where the sails of grain ships bobbed like distant prayers. Coastal cities had one critical advantage over landlocked villages: the ability to beg, borrow, or bankrupt themselves for foreign wheat. Venetian ledgers from the Great Famine reveal a chilling paradox. Their very trade routes that spread prosperity now became lifelines twisted into nooses. A single galley from Sicily could carry enough grain to feed Genoa for a week, but its captain might demand payment in silver plate melted down from church altars. These weren't simple transactions. They were negotiations with desperation, where the price of survival was measured in emptied treasuries and future generations' debt. The mechanics of famine imports exposed brutal realities. Ships didn't arrive out of charity. They followed precise calculations of risk and profit. A Genoese captain's log from 1321 details circling a starving for 3 days, waiting for the mayor to raise his offer from 20 gold florins per sack to 30. Meanwhile, dockworkers too weak to unload cargo sometimes collapsed into holds, their lifeless bodies buried at sea alongside the grain they died trying to reach. The wealthiest towns could play this game. Barcelona once mortgaged its entire salt tax for 5 years to secure Egyptian wheat. But smaller ports faced impossible choices, like the Breton fishing village that traded its fleet of herring boats for a single shipment of Baltic rye, dooming its long-term livelihood to stave off immediate starvation. What's rarely acknowledged is how these crises reshaped medieval globalization. The League, originally a network of herring traders, pivoted to become Europe's emergency grain pipeline, its cog ships now carrying wheat from Poland's fertile plains to Flanders, starving loom workers. Italian bankers developed proto-insurance contracts, where a town might pay upfront for hypothetical future shipments, gambling that famine wouldn't strike everywhere at once. Even the humble fishing smack became a smuggling vessel, its hold packed with contraband barley beneath layers of salted cod when customs officials came sniffing. The human cost of this trade flickers in merchant accounts like candlelight on ledger pages. In Southampton, a customs roll lists a shipment of sweet almonds and sorrow code for grain mixed with sand to cheat weight measurements. Venetian dock records note children pressed into service as grain feelers, their small hands probing sacks for dampness or rot before purchase. Most haunting are the famine tariffs, which show bread prices fluctuating not with local harvests, but with rumors of storms off Sicily or Berber pirates near Gibraltar. For coastal towns, survival now depended on winds and waves hundreds of miles away, a terrifying vulnerability masked as opportunity. Yet these desperate imports also birthed odd alliances. Jewish merchants in Alexandria, exempt from Christian usury laws, became critical middlemen, arranging grain shipments in exchange for royal protections they'd never previously enjoyed. Muslim-ruled Granada routinely sold wheat to its Christian enemies during lean years, valuing profit over holy war. Even the papacy quietly waived trade embargoes, letting grain flow to heretic cities if it kept the peace. The unspoken truth. Famine didn't just move goods across the Mediterranean. It revealed how pragmatism could dissolve borders when empty stomachs outnumbered full ones. The legacy of this trade lingers in our modern world. Today's global food supply chains, for all their complexity, still echo those medieval panic shipments. The same mix of ingenuity and exploitation, the same stark truth that when harvests fail, the rich eat first and the poor pay dearest. Perhaps that's why the accounts from those years read like ghost stories, not because they're ancient history, but because we still haven't escaped their darkest lesson. In a world bound by trade, no one starves alone, but not everyone gets a seat at the table. Along the dried-up riverbeds of Central Europe, strange markings hide beneath the waterline, grooves carved with dates and skeletal hands pointing upward. Locals call them hunger stones, the medieval equivalent of a warning flare. When drought exposed these rocks, it meant the river had fallen so low that no grain barges could pass, and famine loomed. The oldest, found in the Elbe River, bears a chilling inscription from 1415. "When you see me, weep." These weren't mere measurements. They were communal trauma etched in stone, a way to scream across centuries that hunger was coming again. But stones couldn't capture the full horror, so folklore filled the gaps. In Brittany, parents whispered of a skeletal figure who dragged a cart full of starving children during lean years. German villages told of glutton ghosts who materialized at empty tables, gorging on phantom feasts to mock the living. The most haunting were the butter witches of Scandinavia, said to steal milk from cows until their udders ran red with blood. These weren't just campfire tales. They were coping mechanisms, transforming unbearable memories into stories with edges sharp enough to cut complacency. Some legends served as survival guides in disguise. The Irish bean, or banshee, originally a spirit who wailed when famine deaths approached, may have roots in real women who keened warnings about failing crops. Slavic, spirits that pinched lazy farmers' thighs, were really cautionary tales about preparing for hard winters. Even the ubiquitous hunger moon myths, claiming certain lunar phases foretold crop failures, encoded generations of agricultural observation. The line between superstition and science blurred when the stakes were starvation. Oral traditions became time capsules for trauma. In Tuscany, grandmothers taught a rhyme listing 7 famine foods: acorns, nettles, pine bark, and 4 others so bitter they've been forgotten. Its melody was cheerful, its lyrics a survival manual. Basque shepherds passed down songs about the Great Hunger of 1374, not in epic verses, but in precise descriptions of which mountain lichens could be boiled into paste. These weren't histories. They were heirlooms of desperation, polished smooth by retelling. The darkest legends reveal how famine warped perception itself. Czech describe hunger hallucinations, where starving peasants saw fields of ripe grain that vanished when they reached out. A Welsh chronicle tells of a village that slaughtered and ate a prized bull during famine, only to later swear the beast had spoken, pleading for its life in human tongue. Whether these were symptoms of malnutrition or collective psychosis matters less than their power. Proof that hunger didn't just empty bellies, but unraveled reality. Yet some stories defiantly preserved joy. The ghost banquets of Normandy sound macabre, but were acts of resistance. Starving families would set places at empty tables, describing lavish meals in vivid detail to children who'd never tasted butter. Over generations, these imagined feasts crystallized into legends of phantom nobles, eternally dining in haunted castles. Similarly, the Portuguese Festa dos, Feast of Skeletons, began as a dark joke during famine, villagers dressing bones in scraps of finery, and evolved into a carnival celebrating life's fragility. What makes these traditions endure isn't just their horror, but their honesty. Unlike official records listing death tolls and grain prices, folklore remembers the girl who shared her last crust with a beggar only to wake covered in gold coins, or the farmer who sold his soul for a sack of magical seeds that sprouted bones. These weren't lies. They were truth wearing masks, because some wounds are too deep for blunt facts to carry. When every chronicle has crumbled to dust, the stones will still whisper, "When you see me, weep," and the stories will answer, "We remember, beneath the quiet fields of medieval villages, the earth holds secrets in tangled knots of bone, testaments written not in ink, but in calcium and decay." Archaeologists call them famine pits, mass graves where bodies were dumped without coffins or ceremony, layered like firewood in trenches dug by hands too weak to dig deeper. A pit in London's cemetery from the Great Famine of 1315 reveals adults curled around children in protective postures even in death, their bones so light and porous they crumble like chalk when brushed. These weren't orderly churchyard burials, but emergencies carved into dirt, where the living staggered under the weight of their own grief and malnutrition. Science now peers into these graves with tools medieval chroniclers couldn't imagine. Isotope analysis of teeth tells stories mouths never could. Children's enamel etched with stress lines marking winters when their bodies stopped growing altogether. Rib bones, thin as parchment, show the telltale pitting of scurvy and anemia, diseases of prolonged hunger. The skeletons of teenage girls from a Norwich pit bear pelvic deformities from childhood starvation, their bodies forever altered before they could bear children of their own. Even the soil itself confesses. Traces of nematode eggs in burial sites reveal dysentery outbreaks that spread like wildfire through weakened populations. What's most chilling isn't the scale of death, but the quiet violence of its details. A cluster of graves near York holds men with spiral fractures on their forearms, not from battle, but from the brittle bones of starvation snapping under mundane tasks like lifting water buckets. Dental wear patterns show peasants grinding their teeth down to stubs on gritty, famine bread made from acorns and crushed bone. Some skulls bear grooves where scalp tissue tore away during hair loss, a little-known symptom of chronic protein deficiency. These aren't just skeletons. They're biographies written in trauma, each lesion and lesion a sentence in a story too grim for parchment. Yet these graves also whisper unexpected resilience. Some bones show healed fractures from years before death, proof their owners survived earlier hardships. A teenage girl buried in Flanders had legs bowed by rickets, yet her arm bones were thick and strong, likely from years of grinding grain for others in exchange for scraps. Even in mass graves, small gestures endure. A mother's skeleton found in Rouen cradling a bundle that dissolved to dust, leaving only a single hazelnut shell pressed between her ribs. Perhaps she'd saved it as a last gift for a child who never woke. The true power of these discoveries lies in their ability to correct history's biases. Chroniclers wrote of famines as numbers 10,000 perished in Burgundy, but bones force us to reckon with individual suffering. A nobleman's journal might dismiss starvation as God's will, while the skeleton of a 7-year-old from Cologne tells a different truth. Growth arrest lines show he endured 3 separate hunger crises before finally succumbing. Archaeology doesn't just confirm medieval texts, it challenges them, revealing the silent majority whose pain never made it into illuminated manuscripts. What emerges from the soil isn't just tragedy, but a startling intimacy across centuries. The way a laborer's vertebrae fused from years of hauling loads on an empty stomach, the arthritic hands of a grandmother who spent her last days scraping bark for soup. These remains refuse to let us romanticize the past as some simpler time. They force us to see our ancestors not as figures in tapestries, but as people who laughed, loved, and fought to survive, sometimes winning, sometimes leaving their stories etched in bone for us to decipher. The graves are sad, yes, but also sacred, not because they hold saints, but because they prove how fiercely ordinary lives can matter, even when history tries to forget them. 7 centuries may separate us from medieval famine streets, but the tremors of food insecurity still follow eerily familiar fault lines. When supermarket shelves emptied during the early days of the pandemic, the panic felt hauntingly medieval. The same primal scramble for staples, the same bewildered realization that complex supply chains could snap like rotten twine. Modern cities might not see peasants boiling shoe leather, but when a single cyber attack on a meat processor can spike burger prices nationwide, or a war in Ukraine can leave Egyptian bakeries without flour, we're dancing to the same precarious rhythm as 14th century Bruges waiting for Baltic grain ships. The parallels run deeper than temporary shortages. Just as medieval towns learned that walled granaries mattered more than gilded cathedrals during lean years, today's urban planners are rediscovering the wisdom of decentralized food systems. Detroit's vacant lots, transforming into urban farms, mirror the way desperate Parisians turned palace gardens into cabbage patches during the siege of 1870. Barcelona's neighborhoods prioritizing local markets over big-box stores echo the medieval preference for bakeries within walking distance, not because our ancestors were eco-conscious, but because they knew hunger travels faster than carts. Even the resurgence of community fridges, stocked by neighbors for those in need, feels like a high-tech revival of the monastery poor tables that once kept medieval towns alive. Yet for all our technological advances, modern solutions often overlook hard-won medieval wisdom. Where 13th century Siena strictly regulated grain prices to prevent speculation, today's global commodities markets let traders bet on wheat futures while breadlines form. Medieval guilds punished bakers for adulterating flour with sawdust. Meanwhile, modern food deserts flood shelves with processed substitutes stripped of nutrients. The most striking divergence. Medieval famines sparked riots that forced systemic change, like the English Peasants, revolt capping bread prices, while today's food insecurity often meets with resigned shrugs and food bank donations. There's something unsettling about realizing that feudal serfs had more leverage over their food supply than many modern consumers. The hopeful lessons shine through where communities choose to remember. When hurricanes shattered New Orleans' supply chains, it was backyard gardens and Cajun fishermen's informal networks that fed survivors, just as medieval coastal towns relied on local nets when grain ships failed. Modern mutual aid groups organizing grocery deliveries for housebound seniors operate on the same principle as medieval women's bread clubs that pooled resources. Even high-tech innovations like Berlin's app-based food-sharing platforms carry the DNA of those medieval mercy tables, where leftovers were left for the hungry. Perhaps the most vital inheritance from those hard centuries is the understanding that food security isn't about individual stockpiles, but collective webs of care. A medieval peasant might only survive because the blacksmith traded repaired tools for her dried apples, while the miller's wife shared a sourdough starter. Today's equivalents emerge in urban seed swaps, community kitchens, and farmers forming direct bonds with restaurants, all rebooting the personal connections that industrial agriculture severed. Because whether in 1420 or 2024, full bellies alone don't build resilience. It's knowing your neighbor remembers how to preserve tomatoes, your local baker keeps a backup sack of heritage wheat, and somewhere in town, someone still knows which weeds are edible when the trucks stop coming. That's the real medieval survival guide writing itself anew in our time. Medieval towns didn't just suffer famine, they weaponized creativity against it, turning desperation into a survival art form. Think of the baker who mixed sawdust into loaves not to cheat customers, but to stretch flour further for starving neighbors. Or the mothers who taught children to chew pine resin slowly, calling it forest candy to mask its bitterness. These weren't just acts of survival. They were revolutions in miniature, proving that resilience isn't about brute endurance, but the ability to reshape reality itself when the old rules collapse. What's startling isn't how medieval people suffered, it's how their solutions echo ours today. When Venetian merchants hoarded grain to inflate prices, the poor responded with black markets and counterfeit ration tokens, tactics that would feel familiar to anyone who's seen modern-day food smuggling during economic crises. The hunger bred recipes scratched into monastery margins. They're not so different from Great Depression-era cookbooks, teaching families to stretch meals with breadcrumbs and potato peels. Even the medieval practice of burying grain to evade confiscation finds its parallel in modern Venezuela, where families hide rice sacks under floorboards during shortages. History doesn't repeat, but it hums the same chilling tune. Yet the most potent lesson lies in what these towns sacrificed to survive. Solidarity often frayed under hunger's knife. Neighbors turned informers for extra rations. Fathers abandoned children they couldn't feed. But just as often, communities rediscovered their moral spines. The Flemish village that voted to share one family's hidden cheese wheel equally among all 40 households. The English nuns who turned their cloister into an orphanage during the Great Famine, sketching tiny crosses on each child's forehead so they'd at least die with names. These choices weren't just practical. They were declarations of what humanity could still mean when stripped bare. So could you survive a medieval famine? The question isn't really about identifying edible moss or hiding grain. It's about confronting how thin the veneer of civilization actually is. Our supermarkets may be full, but the instincts medieval people honed still linger in our DNA. That twinge of panic when a storm warning flashes, the impulse to buy extra pasta just in case. These are their whispers across time. What changes isn't human nature, but how loudly hunger has to knock before we answer. If these stories of grit and ingenuity resonated with you, there's a treasure trove of untold history waiting on this channel. From the secret networks that kept cities fed during sieges to the forgotten heroes who kings to feed the poor, we dive deep into the past's most gripping survival tales. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, and drop a comment below. What's one modern convenience you'd miss most if famine struck? A coffee machine, refrigeration. Or maybe, like our medieval ancestors, you'd discover strengths you never knew you had when the world turns hungry.